Hey folks, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire to help others accomplish their own primitive building and hunting goals. Thanks for joining us today on an episode of Secrets in Science Chapters, where we go through and break down individual chapters from the Secrets in Science collection of books. Okay, today's chapter we're going to talk about the speed of bows, which is going to be page 64 in the Secrets in Science of Primitive Archery. And when we say the speed of bows, really we're just talking about the speed of arrows, but it's the speed in which the bow shoots the arrow. So I even mentioned that in here. The speed of bows, that title seems to grab people's attention more than the speed of arrows. So every time basically that I say the speed of the bow, don't lose your mind and say, it's the arrow, not how fast the bow's not flying through the air. I know, but there's different times that I refer to it, so just assume that I know what I'm talking about. So let's not worry too much about that. But there's going to be a lot of questions about how fast primitive bows are supposed to shoot, what's a good speed for them per their weight, what about the grains of the arrows, and that's all the kind of stuff that we're going to get into right now. So we'll go ahead and start reading with, there are two significant ways to look at bow speed, which of course again, arrow speed. Most people take the proportional approach to base the bow speed on proportional weighted arrow. For common testing, that is often referred to as a 10 grains per pound arrow, which means 10 grains of arrow weight per 1 pound of the bow's draw weight at full draw. So an example would be a 40-pound bow shooting a 400 grain arrow, or a 50-pound bow shooting a 500 grain arrow, or a 57-pound bow shooting a 570 grain arrow. So again, 10 grains per pound of the bow. And a lot of people go with that metric because it's going to give them almost like an apples to apples comparison with a bow and say, well, proportionally speaking, we'll talk about the, we'll continue on, but at least we'll cover this, that if somebody might have, say, like a 35-pound bow, and it may shoot the same feet per second as, let's say, a 50-pound bow. The difference is the 35-pound bow might be shooting a 300 or 350 grain arrow, where the 50-pound bow could be shooting a 500 grain arrow. Okay, so keep that in mind. In my opinion, this approach gives proportional comparison regarding arrow speed, but not the actual energy of the arrow. So of course, if you understand kinetic energy and momentum even somewhat, the heavier the projectile, the more kinetic energy and momentum it's going to have. So you're going to typically see, not in all situations, but most typically, if all other things are equal, if you have a heavier projectile flying at the same speed as a lighter projectile, then you're going to see more penetration with the heavier projectile. Okay, so backing it up, if you're only taking this as from a proportional comparison, then that's kind of like saying, well, you're pretty fat for a skinny guy, or you're pretty skinny for a fat guy. And it's like, what does that even mean? A person might say your bow shoots pretty fast even though it's only 35 pounds if you're shooting 350 grain arrow. However, it doesn't give any real credit to the terminal energy of the arrow impacting the animal. And that's exactly what we were just talking about, that if you have two bows, one lighter, one heavier, that are shooting lighter arrows, proportionally speaking, 35 pounds, 350 grain arrow, 50 pounds, 500 grain, and they both hypothetically say the arrow flies at 150 feet per second, the 500 grain arrow is going to penetrate deeper, all things else being equal. So the other method that I vastly prefer is to base all of my bow speeds, my arrow speeds, on one standard arrow weight. So while we can calculate any arrows given kinetic energy and momentum, so long as we have the arrow's velocity and mass, This method better reflects the velocity of an arrow most typically used in a hunting scenario. As you'll find out throughout this book, we successfully and efficiently kill animals with a wide range of arrow weights. However, we base a lot of our tests on a 525 grain arrow. That gives us a different perspective on energy and allows us to convey things a little easier. So a bow, in quotations, a bow should shoot a 500 or 525 grain arrow in excess of 150 feet per second to be truly efficient. Okay, now that's just kind of a baseline. That's not an end-all be-all, but that's a good baseline to kind of stick by. But okay, so now moving on, a 35-pound bow may shoot a 350 grain arrow at 150 feet per second, which means it performs well for being a lightweight bow shooting a lightweight arrow. However, that wouldn't be of any reflection into how much energy momentum that arrow carries to its target. So we already explained that. If we do the math on this, a 50 pounds bow shooting a 500 grain arrow at 150 feet per second, so nice round numbers, carries kinetic energy of pretty much 25 foot-pounds with 24.955. So we'll just call it 25 foot-pounds of kinetic energy and momentum of 0.3327 slugs. Now let's compare that to the 35-pound bow shooting a 350 grain arrow at 150 feet per second. So same speed, but a lighter arrow, obviously shot from a lighter bow. The kinetic energy is only 17.5 foot-pounds as opposed to 25 foot-pounds, and the momentum is 0.2329 slugs as opposed to 0.3327 slugs. So despite both projectiles traveling 150 feet per second, the heavier arrow carries much more kinetic energy and momentum versus the light arrow. And that is based on that 10 grains per pound rule. Using feet per second alone would give us wildly different energy readings. Okay, so that is why basing the speed on which the bow shoots a consistent variable weighted arrow is less confusing than having it on the proportional scale. So if you go the proportional route on this, and this is why we need to make sure we cover this at least a little bit better, that if you go that 10 grains per pound and say, well, you know, my 35-pound bow shoots 150 feet per second with this 350 grain arrow, then you might be under the false impression that that is sufficient for shooting through a deer with a stone point. Now, you can probably stick in it and kill it with a steel point. Stone points do have a lot more friction and they are tougher to penetrate animals with. And I'm not saying that it can't be done per se, because it probably can be done, but it's not going to be efficient by any stretch of the imagination. So that's really covered heavily in here, so you understand that. Now there's a lot of other things that are going to affect the speed in which the arrow flies, and that's actually going to be covered a lot more in other chapters as well, because a lot of these chapters in this book, they connect to each other and then they reference, okay, well, now you need to understand stuff about the length of the draw. So the further a bow is drawn, the more stored energy, the longer the power stroke, typically the faster the arrow is going to fly. Okay, so all things being equal, again, let's just say we're shooting a 500 grain arrow on a 50-pound bow. One bow is 50 pounds at, let's say, 25 inches, and then let's say another one is 50 pounds at 30-inch draw. The 30-inch draw bow will shoot the arrow faster and harder than the 25-inch draw because of the longer power stroke, even if the weight of the arrow is exactly the same and the poundage in which it's released is exactly the same. And we did that in the length of draw chapter that's also in the book, which, again, we'll discuss that one in detail another day. Another thing that will affect the speed of the bow or the arrow is going to be the string material that's used. Again, another chapter in the book, So that's going to be modern strings versus natural material strings, but you'll have all the data from that in that as well. But there are many different variables that will affect the speed in which the arrow flies. Okay, now that all being said, we will get on to what should you be striving for, which we already basically covered in the examples that we use. Just hypothetically saying a 500 grain arrow, the weight of the bow doesn't really matter so long as the velocity and the weight of the arrow are matched to give you the kinetic energy of the momentum that you desire. So it really doesn't matter if the bow's 35 pounds. If the bow's 35 pounds and it shoots a 500 grain arrow 150 feet per second, then that's a phenomenally shooting bow. Wonderful. You don't have any problem shooting that. Likewise, if you have a really heavy bow, like let's say a 70-pound bow, but it is an absolute slug, and it shoots a 500 grain arrow at 130 feet per second, you're not really in. It doesn't matter how heavy the bow is. The bow's terribly slow, and it's not going to transfer the energy into the arrow to deliver proper penetration. So right there at the beginning of the book, I actually have something called the answers page, and that is on page 6, and it is the easy answer to knowing, and I always share this with everybody, the easy answers to it, which there's a little bit more to read here, but basically saying preferably 25 plus foot-pounds of kinetic energy, which can be accomplished, as we described, by shooting roughly a 500 grain arrow at 150 feet per second. That is a good efficiency mark. Can you, with shooting stone points, okay? Shooting stone points that are properly sized, properly shaped, have a nice transition. If you can shoot deer or hogs and even elk's on the lower end of it, but it's still very doable. If you can reach those numbers, 25 foot-pounds, you will consistently get enough penetration to efficiently kill the animal repeatedly. Now, yes, you can do it with less. I have seen, personally, have killed deer and hogs with bows that have shot slower, and I've watched other people shoot them with stone points even down to maybe in the 130s feet per second with the same arrow weight, but diminished penetration without a doubt. So that's why I give those numbers to specifically say that's what you should be striving for, is that 25 foot-pounds of energy. So you can easily get on the internet and you can go look up an kinetic energy or an arrow energy calculator, and you can type in the mass of the arrow and how fast it flies and all that, and it's going to give you those numbers to look at. And like I said, with stone point, about 25 seems to be a pretty good number overall. Okay, so we'll back it up just a little bit, because there are a lot of people that are like, well, how do I know if my bow really is shooting fast? Well, shooting through a chronograph is specifically going to teach you a lot more than putting a bow scale on the bow. That doesn't mean quite as much, right? So shooting through a chronograph is going to tell you the velocity of the arrow. That's going to give you the best answer. Now, a lot of people will say, take the poundage of the bow plus 100 feet per second with a 10 grain per pound arrow, and that would be a well-performing, not a super-performing, not an underperforming, but a well-performing primitive bow. They would say 100 feet per second over the bow's weight. So shooting a 10 grain per pound arrow. So again, let's back that up to 35 pounds, shooting a 350 grain arrow at 135 feet per second. That's what they would list as being a well-performing bow. Or a 40-pound bow shooting 140 feet per second with a 400 grain arrow. Or a 60-pound bow shooting a 600 grain arrow at 160 feet per second. Now, but you can see how that they would say proportionately your bow is shooting well. So even at 35 pounds, if you shoot 135 feet per second with a 350 grain arrow, you're really not putting out much energy at all. So proportionately speaking, yes, your bow is a well-performing bow for its weight and the arrow weight that it's shooting, but it's actually not penetrating, and it's not carrying enough energy to efficiently hunt and penetrate into big game. All right, so let's even run the numbers on that here quick, right? So I got up on a kinetic energy calculator here that's on the internet. They're free to use, right? So I punched in 350 grain arrow, which would be that proportional 35-pound bow shooting a 350 grain arrow at 135 feet per second. And if it does that, they would say that is a well-performing self bow. But let's look at the energy is only 14 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, 11 pounds less than the minimum that I would recommend for hunting big game with stone points. So of course then ultimately the way to solve all of that problem is to shoot over a chronograph if you have any doubts. And also, I will have to mention this, it is detailed in the length of draw in the speed of bows chapter. And I actually have quite a bit of data in here as well. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through the book. But I had good friend Donnie Wilkerson, he came over and we tested a whole bunch of different bows. And I had people actually sending their bows in to be tested and included. And we tested a whole bunch of different draw lengths. All these data sheets are in this book, by the way. You can look it up. And then a summary of the data sheets. And we tested a whole bunch of bows. I mean, just pages of them. So there's, I don't know, there's probably, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 20. There's probably 50 bows here that we tested to get average feet per seconds off of. And we included the draw length of the bow. And you can see the correlation to the length that the bow is drawn to compared also to the length of the bow itself. But again, that's a different chapter. So you can see the feet per second that it shot that same exact arrow. So it shot the same arrow weight on every single one of them, and you can see the differences in arrow speed. And you would be able to come in here and actually plug these into that arrow energy calculator and say, okay, well, my bow does very similar to this, and now you would have an answer comparatively. But this kind of brings it to light because there's a lot of bows in here that are even pretty heavy that were shooting relatively low speeds. And then some that, you know, really did shoot some higher speeds as well. Now, a couple other notes here that are really important is discussed in another chapter is we talk about the kinetic energy and the momentum in the Dr. Ashby verse primitive context because it doesn't apply so much to stone projectiles because they have more friction. So you need more performance, more energy in the arrow to efficiently penetrate and lacerate with stone points, generally speaking. So people typically say, well, let's just get a bigger and heavier arrow. I would rather shoot, I hear this all the time, people say, I would rather shoot a really heavy arrow slow and then hit a deer because I'm going to get better penetration. And it's like true to some degree, but you also have to realize that deer are very fast. Even hogs are fast. I have other videos of us hunting where I shoot, and even as I shoot, the hogs are reacting so fast that they're moving and even ducking like deer do sometimes. Not as severe, but they do. They duck some. And still changing the impact of the arrow and hitting them too high because they've dropped or they've started running or they've reacted to the shot. Deer are even faster. So if deer react and their reaction time is incredibly fast, you're really never going to beat the reaction time. But the slower your arrow is, the more reaction time they have and the greater distance that they are moving. So therefore, shooting a lighter weight arrow at a faster speed, as long as you're still at the 25 foot-pounds plus, you're actually going to benefit yourself in deer hunting. So in the opposite effect, let's just hypothetically say we have a 65-pound bow, right? That if we were shooting a 650 grain arrow, let's just say 160 feet per second. Well, that's gonna kill about anything that you shoot with it. But what if you could knock that arrow weight down now, still be way above the kinetic energy threshold? You could probably shoot a 400 grain arrow from that 65-pound bow and have that arrow going at 180 feet per second, you're getting to that deer faster, and you still have plenty of energy to penetrate through that deer, but it's getting there faster. So there are many benefits, as we talk about in here. It's another whole chapter. It says the benefits of light arrows. And so we'll probably talk about that one here very shortly in another video. Like I said, all of these chapters really play into one another. So if you can get away with shooting lighter arrows, then they're going to be flying faster. And as long as they do carry that, minimum 25 foot-pounds for shooting stuff deer-sized, then you're going to be in pretty good shape. And also, at the end of the book, we won't go into too much detail on that, but I actually shoot with a contextual sinew string, so it's a lower performing string using cane arrows. I think the heaviest arrow might have been 470 grains. I think actually the best penetrating arrow might have been 430 grains. All the data is in the back of the book. But I went and shot a young bull bison and got plenty of penetration with a bow that shoots about 160 feet per second, a little bit more I think with those 400 grain arrows, but I never had a single arrow at or above 500 grains. And we still got into a bison plenty of penetration because there's other things we can do, as discussed in other chapters, like shaping your stone points, sizing your stone points, having smooth transition, shooting skinnier tipped arrows, all of that stuff. So keep that in mind too, that the just bigger and heavier and more momentum is not always the answer. There are a lot of benefits to shooting skinnier or lighter or faster flying arrows. So at least hopefully you should have some food for thought. And again, this just leaves this, I think this asked, you probably are asking more questions than this even really answered, but that's why this book is so important, is because we cover all of these things. And remember, these videos that I'm doing, the Secrets and Science chapters, they're all going to be on my website. They're going to be on YouTube as well, in a playlist, in a podcast playlist, but also on my website, huntprimitive.com. You can find it right on the homepage if you want. There's going to be a link to it, and you can go in, and as we do all of these, you'll be able to go in, and we're going to go through it chapter by chapter. So you'll be able to basically get a personal walkthrough of this book with me by watching these videos. So hopefully that at least answered your questions on how fast your bow should shoot, and now or how fast your arrow should shoot, and then also how to gauge that. Definitely some food for thought. Don't fall into that trap of thinking, oh, I'm shooting a 350 grain arrow from a 35-pound bow, at 135 feet per second. So people tell me that that's good, because it's actually not. Okay, so it's not enough. Don't fall into that trap, just like we just went and explained. So if you still don't understand it, go back and listen to it again, because it's really, really important information. I think that's enough for this one. I think that gets you off and running, and then we'll see you on another Secrets and Science chapter, and we'll dive into some of those other chapters that we talked about earlier.